turn to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, and I want to read just 3 or 4 verses to you. For those of you who are with us regularly, you'll know that we're looking at some of the key events in the life of Jesus as recorded by Luke. And I want to look at one of the very significant events that had its consequences long after he had ascended back to his Father at the end of his earthly life. And it is the choosing of his 12 apostles. It says in verse 12 of Luke chapter 6, one of those days Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he designated apostles. Simon, whom he called Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. That's as far as I'm going to read. This was a crucial decision that Jesus made on this occasion. Who of the many disciples would he set apart to be designated as his 12 apostles? We know Jesus had many more disciples than the 12. Later in Luke chapter 10, he sent out 72 of them. And in the following verse 17, after where I finished reading, it says he went down with them and stood in a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea and Jerusalem, etc. So there were many, many who were designated his disciples, but of that crowd of disciples, he chose 12. Mark's gospel tells us that they might be with him. That was the first reason he chose them, and that he might send them out to preach and have authority to drive out demons. So these two purposes for which he set them apart, to be with him, and they stuck with him for the rest of his ministry, and then to send them out and equip them with authority to drive out demons and to preach the gospel. Now, what kind of people do you think Jesus would give this responsibility to? Who is he looking for? What kind of resume would he be wanting when he appoints these men? You see, they're going to be entrusted with the responsibility to become the foundation of the church. That's how they're described in the book of Ephesians, built on the foundation. The church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ as the chief cornerstone. So this was a crucial role. They were going to be the men through whom either the world is going to be turned upside down in that first generation, as it was, and described as that, or these were the men who had caused the movement to fizzle out in one generation. What kind of men was he looking for? What kind of resume would he be asking for? Well, I don't know what you would think about that, but some of us may assume that he was looking for rather extraordinary people, spiritual supermen in some way. But the reality is, as we'll discover this morning, that he called a group of extremely ordinary people. These, we'll discover, are going to be 12 ordinary men, probably represented in kind in this building this morning and listening to my voice on television. You are included. I hope you'll discover, and we'll look at some women as well, because Jesus had women who traveled with him. They weren't apostles, but they traveled with him. We'll talk about them as well, because there's a list of some of them that were given later in Luke's gospel. You see, I used to have the feeling when I was first a Christian that there were certain special people God used, and I wasn't one of them. I didn't have the right kind of background, the right kind of personality, the right kind of gifts, all these kind of things that I thought I don't have. God can't use me. The best I can do is support those God does use, pray for them, listen to them. But I really, although I wanted to be used by God, honestly felt I'm not the kind of person. What a wonderful discovery to make, that Jesus Christ specializes only in ordinariness And with that ordinariness comes all the failures that are part of the baggage of our lives. Now we have this list of 12 men here. And I want to look at this list with you. The first on the list is Peter, Simon Peter. Now there are 4 lists of disciples altogether, one in Matthew, one in Mark, this one in Luke, one in the beginning of Acts. And the one thing they have in common is that Peter is the first in all of the lists. Now some people have concluded from that Peter compiled the list. And if he did, that would be totally in keeping with what we know of Peter. You see, Peter was the extrovert. He was impulsive. He was always talking, always acting. We read more often of Peter than all the other disciples put together. Things like, then spake Peter, up spoke Peter. Peter lifted up his voice and said. We even read, then answered Peter on one occasion when he hadn't been asked anything. Always talking and almost always getting it wrong. Jesus turned to him one day in Matthew 16 and said, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Peter, you're a nuisance. Even described him as satanic. Incredible. If this was describing a Pharisee, we'd understand it. This is describing Peter, the disciple. You don't have a divine perspective, said Jesus. You do not have in mind the things of God. You have a human perspective. You have only the things of men. And you know that all this came to a crushing climax the night that Jesus was arrested, and he told his disciples, tomorrow, all of you will flee. And Peter was indignant. Excuse me, Jesus. Did you say all of us? You forgot about me. I mean, Thomas. We all know Thomas, the doubter. He'll be out the door as fast as he can get. Thaddeus, who's ever heard of him? He'll be gone. John and James, they'll be gone. But you forgot about me. I'll never leave you. And Jesus said, Peter, before the rooster crows, which will be to welcome in the new day tomorrow morning, before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And Peter said, if I have to die with you, I'll never disown you. Jesus, I've been with you for 3 years now. You don't know me, do you? If I have to die with you, did you say they're going to crucify you? If they have to put 4 crosses on that hill and put me on the 4th, don't worry, I'll be there. Wouldn't you want this man to be part of your team? I mean, he's impressive, isn't he? For a few moments. What happened that night? They arrested Jesus, and Peter followed in the distance, and somebody came by and said, excuse me, are you one of his disciples? One of whose disciples? That man they've just arrested. Who they just arrested? Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of where? Nazareth. No, I don't know him, but I thought I saw you with him. No, it wasn't me. Oh, I'm sorry. That's fine. Phew, got off the hook there. Somebody else come by, got a Galilean accent. Aren't you one of his disciples? Funny you should mention that. Somebody else just said that. No, I don't know him. Then a girl came by and said, I know you. You're one of his disciples. And I can't tell you what Peter said, because the Bible censors it. It says he cursed and he swore and denied any knowledge of Christ. I know nothing of blankety, 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 blank. I don't know him. That's just the polite way to say it. This isn't a disciple talking, by the way. He suddenly heard the rooster crow. Cock-a-doodle-doo. And Peter broke down and wept bitterly. Would you have stuck him in your team? Loud, all air, really, you might have said. Well, that's Peter. Next is Andrew. Andrew is the brother of Peter. That's probably his biggest problem. He's overshadowed. He used to be a disciple of John the Baptist, so he's one of the keen ones, you know. He's one of the ones that turns up to everything. And when John the Baptist announced, behold the Lamb of God, Andrew said, if he's the Lamb of God, I'm going to join him, and became one of his first disciples. But he said very little and did very little that marked him out as being great in any way. The only time he appears, apart from when he's named once or twice with Peter, James, John, and Andrew once, the 4 of them were together, but the only time he's mentioned is when Jesus was preaching to 5,000 men, and they ran out of food. That men may mean men, which means with their wives, that's 10,000. With their kids, that's probably, 100,000. 20,000, a huge crowd. If it means people, it's still a big crowd. And they had no food. And it was Andrew who brought a boy to Jesus and said to Jesus, here's a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. I imagine the boy with his little bag of lunch looked into the faces of these disciples. Oh, who's the one that I can approach? Who's the friendly one? Went to Andrew, and Andrew was kind enough to take him to Jesus. But he apologized to Jesus, said, what are these amongst so many? I mean, here's the boy. What a cute boy. He wants to give his lunch. Isn't that wonderful, Jesus? But what use is that? Andrew had a little concept of what Jesus might do in that situation. That's Andrew. And then there's James and John. We'll look at them together because they were brothers, the sons of Zebedee. They used to be fishermen in partnership with Peter and Andrew. The 4 of them had a little business on Galilee, and Jesus has called them together. But James and John, the sons of Zebedee, are often listed together. And we have given John the reputation of being the apostle of love. John is a sort of touchy-feely one. And when you read his letters, you realize why we call him the apostle of love. But when you read the story of John in the 4 Gospels and James, they were anything but apostles of love. They were hard, they were arrogant, they were self-seeking. There was one occasion Jesus came to Samaria. You can read this in Luke chapter 9. He was on his way down to Jerusalem, and he came to Samaria, and it says that he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him, but the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. And when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, now listen to this question, these apostles of love. Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven and destroy them? Well, that's very loving, isn't it? Lord, they won't let us stay here. Do you want to call fire down from heaven and just burn them up? And it says, and Jesus turned and rebuked them. That was James and John. Burn them up. Another occasion, John met somebody, and he says that in Luke chapter 9, you can read this sometime, verse 49, we saw a man driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us. Who do you think you are? You're not one of us, are you? Tried to deny him, and Jesus rebuked him again. And then one day, the 2 brothers, James and John, made an incredible request to Jesus. They came to Jesus, and they said to Jesus, when you are in your kingdom, will you let one of us on your right and one of us sit on your left? In other words, their expectation was that Jesus was going to establish a kingdom in Israel, throw off the Roman authority, and will you let us be one on the right, one on the left? Will you let us be the key pins in this organization you're going to set up, this kingdom you're going to set up? And Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Do you understand what this entails, James and John? Can you be baptized with the baptism I'm going to go through? And you know what they said? They said, we can. Sure. No problem. Then later, Matthew chapter 20 and verse 20, it tells us there that the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons and kneeling down asked a favor of him. What is it you want, he asked. She said, grant that one of these 2 sons of mine might sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. You see, they'd asked Jesus and he had said no, so they went home and they told Mommy, he won't let us. You come with me. March back to Jesus. I'll talk to him. She knelt down holding both hands of both boys. Please let them sit either side of you in your kingdom. They hadn't a clue, of course. They were just self-seeking. Jesus gave a nickname to these 2 brothers in Mark chapter 3 and verse 17, where you have a list, Mark's list of these disciples. And it says that it lists him as James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges. What does that mean? I imagine James saying to John, what do you think that means, John? And John said, I think that means my favorites. Yeah, the best in the bunch, the blue-eyed boys. Do you know what it means? It tells us it means sons of thunder. Because these two boys, two brothers, were arrogant and proud and destroyed the people in Samaria. Sons of thunder, selfish seeking. Isn't it amazing that John did become the apostle of love? That wasn't what he was naturally. James, who said, we can drink the baptism you'll be baptized with. It was James who was the very first of those 12 to be martyred. In Acts chapter 12, he did have a baptism to go through when Herod executed him in the early years of the church. But the time that they spent the 3 years with Jesus, they weren't like that. And then Philip is the next one listed. Philip was probably the first of Jesus' disciples. He also used to be a disciple of John the Baptist. He came from Bethsaida. And when John introduced him to Jesus, Philip was one of the ones who left with Andrew and joined Jesus. But Philip only ever speaks twice in the 4 Gospels. And I like Philip because he comes across as a little bit simple, a little bit slow to catch on to things. Jesus did a little test of Philip in John chapter 6. Let me read it to you. It says in John 6 and verse 5, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? These were the 5,000, of course. Turn to Philip. Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? And I love the next verse. It says, he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. In other words, he said, Philip, come up here a moment. Philip, I want to do a little test on you. Okay? There's 5,000 people out there. Yeah, I thought it was a lot. And they're hungry. Yeah, so am I. And they're wondering where the food is coming from. Yeah, funny you should mention that. I was wondering that myself. Well, Philip, how are we going to feed 5,000 people? Work it out, would you? What did Philip do? Well, he said, anybody got any money? Judas, how much is in the bag? 200 denarii, is that all? He came back to Jesus, said 200 denarii would not be enough for each one to have a bite. In other words, he said, Jesus, we can't do it. Just supposing Jesus did the same test on an atheist. He asked the question, is there an atheist in the crowd? Would you come up here, Mr. Atheist? There's 5,000 people out there. Yeah, I thought it was a lot. And they're hungry. Yeah, so am I. They're wondering where the food's coming from. Yeah, I was wondering that myself. Well, Mr. Atheist, how are we going to feed them? What do you think the atheist would do? I'll tell you what he'd do. He'd do exactly what Philip did. He'd say, how much money we got? Who's the treasurer? What's your name? Judas? How much is in the bag? 200 denarii? Is that all? That's not enough, is it? He'd come back and say to Jesus, 200 denarii would not be enough for each one to have a bite. That's what the atheist would say. What does that tell you about Philip? It tells you he was a professing disciple, but a practicing atheist. In other words, the way Philip responded to the situation was totally human, exactly the way any atheist would respond to the situation. And so Jesus tested him and discovered Philip was learning nothing. Really encouraging that, isn't it? They'd probably been with Jesus about half his ministry at this point, and Philip's learning nothing. And later in John chapter 14, when Jesus began to explain, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. And Philip said, show us the Father, and that'll be enough. Quit all this theology. Just show me. Just give me a picture. That's Philip. I like him. He's simple. He's uncomplicated. Has learned very little. And then comes Bartholomew, the next on the list. And this name, Bartholomew, only ever occurs when there are lists of the disciples and his name comes in it, but we don't know of anything else that Bartholomew ever did. But it is quite likely that Bartholomew is who John in his gospel calls Nathanael. Now, Nathanael was one of the ones who Philip wanted to introduce to Jesus, and he brought him to Jesus and said, this is the one, we've found the one whom Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael's answer was, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? That was not the way to win friends and influence people, is it? Nazareth, that writes him off for a start. That was Nathanael's response. Prejudiced? Categorizing someone simply by their associations? And he's only ever mentioned once again after the resurrection when 7 disciples were listed as being in Galilee, and Nathanael was named as one of them, probably the same as Bartholomew. He never did anything that was worth recording. And then Matthew is the next one. Matthew, you well know as the tax collector. And as a tax collector, he would be regarded as amongst the lowest of the low because they were Jews, but they were traitors to their own people because they served the Romans, who were the occupying forces. They had to provide so much taxation for the Roman government, and what they gained as their own cut above that was their own business, and so they were notorious for their corruption. And tax collectors are given a special category. It talks about sinners and tax collectors in the category all of their own. Matthew was a tax collector. His name was Levi, and Jesus called him, and he became a disciple. He has 2 names, you see. He's called Levi in Mark and Luke's gospel. He's called Matthew in Matthew's account. He's called Matthew in this list here in Luke's gospel. And the name Matthew means gift of God. I think it was Jesus who probably gave him that name. Jesus gave several people different names. Simon, he called Peter. Levi, that was the name probably his mother gave him. Nothing to do with the clothes he wore. But Levi, I know who you are. I know your background. I know you're a man robbed of self-esteem, robbed of dignity, kicked around. As we know, Zacchaeus was one of his colleagues who had been kicked around. I want to give you a new name. Here's your name. It's called Gift of God. I know you used to be a thief. Now you've become a gift of God. And it is Matthew who wrote one of the Gospels for us. The Gospel itself doesn't say who wrote it, but ever since the first century it's been attributed to Matthew the disciple. At least he would have had the basic skills of writing. As a tax collector, some of the disciples wouldn't have had those skills at the time. And then Thomas is the next one. The only reference we have to Thomas is in John's Gospel. And he's best known, of course, for his doubting the resurrection of Jesus. He was absent when Jesus appeared to his disciples. And when Thomas came back, they said, Thomas, you won't believe this, but Jesus himself is alive. He appeared to us. And Thomas said, don't talk such nonsense. I saw him die. They said, but Thomas, he's alive. Unless I put my fingers into the nail prints in his hand and my hand into the sword wound in his side, I will not believe, said Thomas. And when Jesus later appeared to Thomas, he immediately recognized him. He didn't need to put his fingers in the nail prints in his hand. He fell on his knees and said, my Lord and my God. The trouble is, forever after, Thomas is known as doubting Thomas. We should call him believing Thomas, because he did believe very quickly. But we know him as the doubter. He's the pessimist. Certainly we know in John chapter 11, when Lazarus died and the word came to Jesus, Jesus stayed where he was, and Thomas speaks and says, let's all go and die with him, which is not the brightest suggestion anybody ever made. Let's all go and die. It's pessimistic perspective on things. Does that ring a bell with anybody, by the way? Make a good disciple. Then there's James, the son of Alphaeus. We don't know anything about James, the son of Alphaeus, except that his father's name was Alphaeus. He's also called James the Younger, or James the Less, probably to distinguish him from James, the brother of John. And by the way, that means he was probably very young, because James and John still lived at home. We know that John wrote the book of Revelation in the 90s, AD 90s. They would have been young men. James and John lived at home. They normally married at a reasonably young age in those days. James the Younger, probably still in his mid-teens or so. But we know of nothing he ever said or did. He was a non-entity in that sense. And then Simon the Zealot is the next in the list. Now, the Zealots were an important movement. In AD 6, they had been founded, led by a man called Judas the Galilean. And the Zealots revolted against the Roman authority on the grounds that paying taxes to Rome was treason, because they were God's people and Israel had only allegiance to God. And so they led this movement that stopped paying its taxes and tried to live independently of the Roman Empire. And the Romans crushed the Zealots very quickly, but the spirit of the Zealots continued for many years, which means that this man, Simon the Zealot, was what we would call today a political activist. The kind of man who joined Jesus with a political agenda. I don't know, but I think it's very likely to have been Simon the Zealot who asked the question before Jesus' ascension, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? It says one of the disciples asked him that. I don't know who, but I think it might well have been Simon the Zealot. That would have been in keeping with his interest. When we're going to get this kingdom established and throw off the Romans, that was his agenda. And by the way, in every other circumstance, a zealot and a tax collector would have hated each other. Certainly the zealot would have hated the tax collector. The opposite ends of the spectrum. One was the nationalist, one was the traitor. And yet Jesus said, Matthew, I want you to be one of my team. Simon the Zealot. Come and sit next to Matthew. Explosive combination. Yet they're found together as disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ. And then the 11th is Judas, son of James. He's called in this list, in the Gospel of Matthew, in the list we're given there, he's called Thaddeus. He's one of my favorites. Actually, the King James calls him Lebbeus, whose surname is Thaddeus. So his real name was Lebbeus Thaddeus. That's a tongue twister. I'm glad he didn't write a gospel. You turn to Lebbeus Thaddeus, chapter 4. You sort of get, by the time you've pronounced it, everybody's gone home. But Thaddeus was the disciple no one's ever heard of. He's the one that causes quiz teams to lose points. They can think of 11 of the disciples. Who in the world was the 12th? And one time he was described, and I think this tops every name given to these disciples. His name was Judas, son of James, here in Luke. He was Thaddeus in Matthew. He is called in John chapter 14, Judas, not Iscariot. In other words, known by who he's not. He was the treasurer, actually. He's the one who looked after the money. Most times that Judas occurs in the four Gospels, it has to do with money. When Mary anointed Jesus in Bethany with costly ointment, Judas was indignant. He objected. He said, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. Well, that sounds pretty honorable, doesn't it? But John adds a little note after that. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. That's John's little note he adds after that. You see, I think Judas is misunderstood. If you look at portraits of the 12 disciples, and you often see them, for instance, at the Last Supper, and you've got Jesus always in the middle. Jesus always dressed in white for some reason. The others all have some color about them. And next to Jesus on one side, you find somebody who's got a nice bushy beard. His mouth is open. You know exactly who that is. That's Peter. He's talking. On the other side, another one who's sort of leaning towards Jesus. His head is slightly tilted towards Jesus. I know that is. That's John. But always right at the periphery, There's one who his body is turned slightly the other way from the rest. He's gaunt looking. His eyes are droopy. You say to yourself, I wouldn't touch that one with a barge pole. That must be Judas Iscariot. I don't think Judas was like that at all. Otherwise, you wouldn't have made him the treasurer. Judas would appear reliable and confident. In the upper room, Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. And they didn't say, uh-oh, I knew it had come, Judas. Nobody said that. They were aghast, and the people said, Lord, is it I? But it can't be Judas. But it was. And Judas committed suicide at the very time Jesus was hanging on the cross. The next morning, a tragic end. But Jesus knew that all along, because once he said to the disciples, have I not chosen you, the 12, yet one of you is a devil? That must have made the disciples start to think. Who's he talking about? And I imagine they probably all agreed. Peter. I mean, after all, Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. That's a pretty good clue, isn't it? Watch Peter. He's the one. And yet Jesus brought him into his team. And there are some women with Jesus too, who traveled with him at least some of the time. They weren't designated apostles, but they provided from their material needs. Most of them seem to have been called Mary. I mean, there's Mary Magdalene, there's Mary the mother of James and Judas, Mary the wife of Cleopas, Mary the mother of James the Less, Mary the sister of Martha, Mary the mother of Jesus was with them sometimes. In Luke chapter 8 and verse 1 to 3, it says, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Wow, that's an impressive lady to have in your team. She's the wife of a man called Chuza, who was the chief of Herod's staff. Her name was Joanna. She was one of the women who came with him. Then there was Susanna. We know nothing about Susanna. And many others, it says. And it says these women were helping to support them out of their own means. These women were the ones who earned the money. Some out of their own means. We imagine Joanna was wealthy, being married to Chuza, the head of Herod's chief of staff. Susanna might have been wealthy. We don't know. But even amongst the women, you see, you've got the contrast of Mary Magdalene, 7 demons driven out of her, a woman who lived in the gutter before she met Jesus. Now she is brought alongside Joanna, the wife of Chuza, in the same team. What a bunch of very ordinary people, ranging from your Peters, the loudmouth, impulsive, always talking, to Thaddeus, the non-entity, the Judas, not Iscariot. Ranging from arrogant James and John, who want to destroy the enemies, to James, the son of Alphaeus, who is so meek and mild, most of the gospel writers forgot to mention him. Simon the zealot, the patriotic nationalist, to Matthew, the traitor, the tax collector. The sharp-minded Thomas, who needed proper evidence. I don't just believe things, you need to prove it to me. To simple Philip, who just drifted along, who didn't want to know anything. Just show us the fault. That'll be enough. From John, who rested his head on Jesus' shoulder, describes himself as a disciple whom Jesus loved, to Judas, the traitor, who for 30 pieces of silver was willing to see him go to his death. From Joanna, from the top drawer, the wife of the head of Herod's household, chief of staff, to Mary Magdalene, the demon-possessed one. What a bunch of ordinary people. Probably the equivalents of sitting right here this morning, listening to television. Exactly the kind of person you are somewhere in this list of men and women. But the marvelous thing is that Jesus takes ordinary people, and for what purpose? He calls them to do extraordinary things. What is the key to ordinary people doing extraordinary things? Because these 12, Jesus sent out with authority and power, it says. What is the extra in the ordinary that makes the ordinary extraordinary? I'll tell you what the extra in the ordinary is. It's Jesus himself. He gave them authority, it says. He called them to him. He sent them to preach and heal the sick. Where does the extra come from? Where does the power come from? Exactly where it comes from in your life and mine. You see, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26. He says, not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. By the way, he says not many, not any. There are those who come from positions of influence. That's true. But he says not many of you were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But listen to this. God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. Therefore, as it's written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. It's a great day in your life, as it was a great day in my life when I discovered and realized and was willing to acknowledge I'm foolish, I'm weak, I'm despised, amongst the things that are not. Because that is the very category that Paul says that's where Jesus exhibits his power. So if you're going to boast, he says, boast about him. And you see these ordinary men, the fishermen who probably had no education formally, the tax collector whose neighbors would have shunned him, the teenage boys, James the younger, the women who traveled with him. These were those to whom he's going to entrust turning the world upside down. Not because they themselves could say, Lord, here's my resume. I hope you're impressed. Look at all these good things about me. No, because I come as one who's weak and foolish. Please exchange my weakness for your strength, my folly for your wisdom, that no one may boast before him. So as Jesus said on another occasion, let your light shine before men. They will see your good works and they will praise your Father who's in heaven. Because although they see your good works, they recognize the origin is God himself. So Jesus picked 12 of the most ordinary people you could imagine. And maybe there's somebody here this morning and you say, well, I recognize my ordinariness and my failure. You may have seen in some way a reflection of your own personality and character and behavior in some of these disciples, and you've concluded, I'm not yet good enough for Jesus. Well, you'll never be good enough if there was any measuring stick other than the acknowledgement of your own weakness and sin. That's what makes you good enough, that you're willing to say, I am a sinner. I am in myself prone only to failure. But I come just as I am and say, Lord Jesus, take me, use me, you will.